analysis. I'm sure you're all familiar with, what are the strengths and weaknesses, the opportunities, or the threats or challenges. They forecasted the direction based on trends, usually including demographic type information. They identify a preferred direction or a vision of setting goals, and they determine a course of action to reach it. We did an analysis sort of more qualitative, looking at what our state planning processes are, interviewing people, and determined that our processes here in Connecticut are very decentralized and single issue oriented, that it's not strategic, and that the planning that we do has an emphasis on physical planning, conservation and development, transportation, developing of roads, and not in terms of more the human capital. What are we doing for education, human services, economic development? Those areas are less a priority than physical planning in Connecticut. And often we found that any planning that we do is either in response to a legislative mandate where the legislature will require a plan to be developed in a specific area, or it's in response to a plan, if you want to call it that, in terms of applying for federal funding. We've listed sort of a series of deficiencies that we found with Connecticut planning, that it hasn't been a priority with the executive branch since probably the Weicker administration, when the governor had established back in the early 90s the Connecticut Progress Council, and that had operated for about 4 or 5 years, but it didn't survive the change in administration. And so while it's still on the books, we found that it's been, for all intents and purposes, defunct for about 50 years. There's no clear vision, as I said. There's an emphasis on physical planning. Staffing-wise and structure-wise, we made the determination that Connecticut is not equipped, really, doesn't have the capacity, staffing-wise, to do good long-range planning at this point, and that it's episodic and responsive to legislative mandates, as I said, and it's recognized as inadequate by many Connecticut towns. And if you pick up a copy of the report, we did also a study last year on regional planning organizations and Homeland Security, and we sent a survey regarding all 3 of those areas to all 169 towns, the first selectmen or chief elected official of those towns, and they rated state long-term planning pretty negatively. So if you pick up a copy of that report, that we talked about results of that survey. Also in the report, we've listed a table of, from our review of the literature, what are identified as best practices in terms of state long-term planning, and we've listed some of them here. For example, there has to be committed leadership. Somebody has to be, take the role of spearheading the whole exercise, and be its champion, really. There has to be an oversight board, but it has to be of manageable size, and that kind of is what we're dealing with right now. I'll get to a little later. I'll tell you that the report, or most of it, has been incorporated into a bill, and it's working its way through the legislature. But one of the contentious issues is who is on the oversight council. The legislative branch wants equal representation to the executive branch, and so those kinds of things that you don't think are going to be an area of a problem, often are quickly issued. There has to be buy-in from the state agencies. It's important, I think, that there be a limited number of long-range goals. One of the things that the Progress Council, I think, did in the mid-90s was try to do too much and tried to cover state government and sort of imploded, it couldn't keep up with what the requirements of that would be. There has to be appropriate indicators that don't overwhelm the agencies. I think it's important to start small and in a manageable way and build upon your successes. And provide timely information. And it has to be shown that it's going to be used. I mean, it can't be just an exercise for the sake of doing it. Agencies and the people collecting the data and submitting it and reviewing it have to recognize that it's going to be used to make decisions, or again, it won't be sustained. And in terms of the capacity, again, there has to be a core of committed, knowledgeable staff. In the report, we made a recommendation that the staff, there be an additional 5 analysts hired within the Office of Policy and Management. Again, whether that happens this legislative session, I don't know. And finally, there has to be a transparent process that the public can see that how the decisions are being made, and that holds the agencies accountable for achieving goals, or admitting or saying why they aren't. We held a forum in November. I don't know if any of you here might have attended it. It was sponsored by our committee and co-sponsored really by the Institute of Regional and Municipal Affairs at Central Connecticut State University. It was moderated by a staff person, a well-known expert in state planning from the Council of State Governments in Lexington, Kentucky. And we had representatives of two considered model states in terms of state planning. One was from Virginia, and they have an initiative there in Virginia called Virginia Performs. And also the state of Washington was represented there at the forum, and their effort under Governor Gregoire is called Government Management Accountability and Performance, GMAP. And they were both excellent, and I think it was important for our committee to hear firsthand how states do it and how it can work. And so between what they heard at the forum and the research that we had done in the literature and whatever, really was the basis of the framework for the recommendations that we put in the report and the guts really of the bill that is currently in the legislature. And so there are 4 major recommendation areas that we came up with: the creation of an oversight council, and we set forth in the bill and in the report where that oversight council should be located in the Office of Policy and Management, and that the major functions be performed in the executive branch. It describes what the functions are, but I think it's important, and we say this in the report, that you shouldn't reinvent the wheel here either. There are other efforts that are ongoing in state. For example, the Department of Economic and Community Development is out holding regional forums. They may have completed them by now, to hear public input on what the goals should be for a state economic development strategic plan. So we indicated in our report that we should build on that and not go out and keep the whole thing all over again, in terms of state long-term plan. And finally, we made recommendations in terms of accountability and transparency of the process, including progress and results. And these are just basically what the council do. It's sort of fleshing out of what those recommendation areas are. So I won't go into it. There are the 5 analysts, and sort of listing the 3 of them should, what background, skills, and knowledge they should have. This is all in the report. And then the other 2 analysts should be kind of more technologically oriented and have skills in that area. Again, building on what we already have, we think that there should be a greater connection with the State Data Center, which used to be at the Office of Policy Management, is currently housed out at the University of Connecticut, and they do demographic work and whatever. We are suggesting that this new council build on that, and that they would perform the demographic for the additional costs were about $1 million. Some of that is ongoing, some of it would be ongoing costs. And then in terms of transparency and accountability, we're recommending, that as much as possible that all of the meetings be open and televised by CTN, that at least quarterly there be meetings with the state, with the agencies, and it's important that the heads of those agencies be held accountable for how the agency programs are working in terms of achieving stated broad goals. And as I mentioned, most of the recommendations from the report have been incorporated into a bill, Senate Bill 176. It was reported out of our committee a couple of weeks ago, and it was referred to the Government Administrations and Elections Committee, and they have a meeting today, March 19th deadline. So I think it will move out of that committee, but as to what will happen to it after that, can't predict. And that sort of was a quick synopsis of the last 8 months, 9 months of work and report. Thank you for inviting me in.
Thank you, Catherine. Look forward to it. For people. Without further ado, let me turn it over to perfect.
Sorry for the space here.
Oh, no, that's
Yeah.
I'll sort of just start up and I'll see my husband. I'm sorry I didn't prepare a presentation. But what I want to talk to you about is I'm fairly new to the state of Connecticut. This is my second semester here at UConn, and I'm in the geography department. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes explaining how that relates to public policy, because I know in this country geography is not a very well-known discipline. We basically, in the field of geography, we look at relationships between place and people and the natural environment, and we also look at the relationship of one place to another and how sort of the topography, the lay of the land might influence things. And my specialization in public policy, as it relates to public policy, is a spatialization of cost-benefit analysis. So it's not just the traditional model that we're used to in looking at public policy, where we net the costs and benefits and decide a project is feasible if the benefits exceed the costs, but it's to look underneath the data spatially and really investigate who is benefiting and who is paying a differentially higher cost. So different projects that I've looked at are things like transportation networks. So if we put in, for example, I know there's been an initiative to put in a rail transportation from New Haven to Springfield here, sort of not just to say is the project feasible, but to decide which areas are going to benefit at the expense of others. So that's my sort of background, and when I came to Connecticut, I was quite interested in doing some work here locally, and one of the very important requirements that I have is to have quite extensive data sets, and one of the ways that we tend to evaluate whether a project, what the impacts of a project have been, is to look at metrics. And some of the most commonly used metrics are the response of house prices or land values on a particular project, because that's seen as a very sort of tangible market response. And when I came to Connecticut and I said, okay, well, I need to find out what type of work I can do locally, because I do want to become engaged in local issues, I find that there isn't very well coordinated data. And this surprised me quite a lot. And I think this goes to something that was highlighted in the report. There seems to be a lot of policy making going on in this state without really having the ability to quantify what those potential impacts might be, or for policies that are implemented to to really scientifically, rigorously, and objectively quantify whether or not those particular projects have met the intended goals. And there are, it's patchy. When I come to sort of look at particular, go to particular towns and talk to them about what data they have, some towns have very well-defined data sets. The smaller towns who are in charge of their sort of data collection, particularly, I don't know if any of you do or have heard of GIS, one of the main tools that I use. The smaller towns don't have that capacity. And what I am looking at in terms of statewide is there's a sort of internal statewide digital divide where the larger towns have a capacity to do policy making and to really understand what they're doing and what the impact of the policies are, and the smaller towns lack those resources. And what the implication of that is, as far as I can see, is that it really limits the capacity of the state to do any statewide planning. It can further sort of exacerbate some of the disparities that currently exist in the state, and it can really limit the ability of the state to engage in really meaningful regional planning. So say if it was for the state of, for the region of New England, if it was looking at climate change policies or air pollution strategies or economic growth, which is one of the more important factors here, it really constrains that ability. So what I have done is I'm working with the Centre for Transportation and Urban Planning, which is at UConn. I think it's just been set up quite recently, to find the resources to evaluate exactly what data exists in Connecticut and to centralize it all at the centre. The other thing, so that's an important part of what I see, an important thing that I just like to draw on from the report as being very, very necessary in my eyes to even, before we even think about making policy, I think we have to really wrap our arms around, are we doing the right thing? How can we even tell if we don't have these data sets? So the other thing that I'd like to highlight is, I came from Arizona, and it's never been seen as a poster child for smart growth. I actually moved to New York City, and I was having a culture shock because I used to get the subway and sort of go about my business. It was always really busy, but I got to Arizona and I was like, okay, where's the buses? Where's the transportation? I think there were 3 buses when I got there, and then they ran about every 2 hours or something. And you need the cars. It's the ultimate automobile-dependent society. I wish I had my slides with me, because the expanse of the urban area in metropolitan Phoenix is about 100 miles by 75. So that is huge, and it's currently got about 3 million people, and the local authorities, which is predominantly the Maricopa Association of Governments, is the regional coordinating body, are planning for a doubling of the population in about the next 10 years. They've grown sort of probably 50-fold since the 60s. The area has just sort of exploded. And so what I think has happened is that they've really had to put some thought into long-term planning, because they can't continue to just keep moving outwards. And one of the reasons, I think they'd like to, in some respects, because it's easier. And one thing that was highlighted in the report, which is a major consideration in everything, is political support for things and cooperation, and getting everybody on the same page, so that there is some agreement as to what is that best preferred future, or the agreed upon preferred future. But there have been a couple of situations that have really motivated the local politicians, what we would call in academia the urban regime, all the decision makers, the developers, the people who were sort of the movers and shakers in the business world, things like that, to really sit down and decide we really need to come up with the plan here. One of them is that the area is out of compliance, the whole entire metropolitan area is out of compliance with federal air quality standards. And it's for a number of criteria pollutants. The main ones are ozone, which is really exacerbated by the sort of the intense solar radiation that they get. And I think it's also particulate matter. That's basically dust that gets blown up, and I think it gets worse because a lot of the desert area gets sort of platted out for development. And I must add, there are 40,000 housing units a year going up. So it's there are swathes and swathes of land that are sort of driven over and sort of prepared for predominantly single-family house construction. So there's brown clouds. The governor of the state has issued a mandate on the brown cloud, all these different types of things. But the fundamental issue is that unless the state or the metropolitan area, which houses the majority of the population in the state, was to do something about this situation, it would lose all access to freeway funding. So basically, the different areas struck a deal with each other. There was a regional transportation plan put in place. The cities of Phoenix, Tempe, and Mesa, which are three of the largest population centres, decided to go ahead with a light rail system. So they're putting some public transportation in, and they're thinking very seriously about where growth takes place and what type of growth it is. And there's been a real shift towards what was, I was quite surprised to see this missing from the report, this sort of whole consideration of sustainability. And I'll just sort of, that's not sort of got much in here. Yeah, it's usually sort of depicted schematically with three sort of intersecting circles. And one's economy, the other one's environment, and the other one's society. And sustainability, these are sort of largely considered to be the three pillars. And the basic idea is that you can't grow sustainably, or you can't function in a sustainable manner if you are focusing entirely on economic factors. If those are all of your goals that are geared towards economic growth, you may cause negative implications for the environment. And I think we see that in some places. I think it's particularly pertinent in places like Arizona, where you can't continue to grow the economy through population expansion at the expense of the environment. And there's a really practical issue. But one of them being there's really bad health effects from having all this air pollution. It's got one of the highest asthma rates in the country. The other, again, people have all sorts of interactions with heat exhaustion and respiratory illnesses. But the very practical thing is that people moving to these areas are motivated quite often by quality of life issues. And so the environment and the quality of the environment and the ability to recreate outdoors and do all these different things and go to the national parks and things is part and parcel of what's motivating this economic growth. So I think they've kind of latched onto that. And as far as the report goes, the findings had stated that in Connecticut there was a little bit too much emphasis on environment at the expense of these other two factors. So in that sense, what the report is saying is that if we sort of use this heuristic device, is that it's just a little bit, the planning is just a little bit overemphasizing the environmental factors. So I know that I've talked with some people who are looking at balanced growth in Connecticut, and they are concerned about the restrictions that some of the environmental policy puts on opportunities to attract economic development to the area. So this is just sort of, there's always a tension between these three things, and it's a question of recognizing that they're all intertwined. The other component is society. So this can be things like equity issues. As far as Connecticut is concerned, one of the main considerations appears to be the loss of highly educated, I would call them, from an academic perspective, I'd call them the creative class. I think we've come to think of our students emerging out of quite good education in Connecticut as being members of the creative class, the 25 to 35-year-old, innovative, technologically savvy, very well educated people. This might be what we might emphasize if we're looking at Connecticut, is once we have people leaving the state, we have a pass-through to economic considerations here. We have a flow of funds going into investing in human capital, and when people leave, there's an inability to get a return on that investment in human capital. And from a sort of fiscal perspective, what will happen if we continue to see an aging of the population because of out-migration of people might be sort of an additional taxation burden put on the people who live in the individual municipalities. I think if I'm not wrong, all of the individual towns are legislatively mandated to balance their budgets through property tax. Is that right? So I think if the income is not there, then they have to pass it straight through to the people in the town via the property tax mechanism. And if once the population starts to age, we have to think that people are sort of to an increasing extent on a fixed income, and they're taking on an increasing share of the property tax burden. So I don't know what the triggers are. I don't know really what the sort of evolution of that process is, but we seem to have some sort of latent issues here in Connecticut. It's not the big, high-profile sort of reports that are done from, say, things like the EPA. You're out of compliance with air quality standards, you're going to lose your freeway funding. To put everybody into this mode of saying, okay, we need to do something, it seems to be just a little bit more subtle. And what I would recommend, or what I see a really big opportunity for, is to get some coordination now, so that we can try and investigate, have the data to try and build some models to say, well, what would happen if this. And there's just one thing I would like to mention about the report. This is just in my experience from working with different groups in different places. It's not necessarily in the United States. There's a lot of it going on in developing countries, particularly with the United Nations and its scenario analysis. When we come to look at the preferred futures, in order to get a preferred future, you have to have political consensus. But what's also a really interesting and informative process, and I think you see this from a really important part of the policy-making process, is understanding how how different groups react to alternative futures that are proposed. So once we have the data, we can start making scenario analyses and saying, well, we can build this model and say, okay, they've shifted away from being deterministic, saying this is going to happen. It's all about, if you make this decision, this is what we estimate will happen. If you make this decision, this is what will happen. And sometimes it's the process of putting forward those alternatives to people, particularly to engage with the public and saying, well, this is what we've done. We've got 4 scenarios. One is always business as usual. Look, this is what will happen if we don't do anything. This is what will happen if we, and then you start building on that. And it's a process of presenting to the general public and bringing them into the decision-making process of, this is what we've come up with. Now what should we do? And then that's how the research ends up getting linked back through policy to the general public. So I just wanted to mention that because it's a really powerful tool that's been used. And one of the really interesting parts of this is you really, even just sitting down and watching these processes take place, or the negotiations take place, you can get a really good feel for everybody's positionality. And it can really help you to understand what people's agendas are. So that in and of itself, but without the data to even start building these scenarios, we're a little bit limited. So I just wanted to close by just saying I think there's a really good opportunity to start thinking about what we need to do here in Connecticut. But I think the first step definitely is getting some sort of coordination on the data front. So I was very heartened to see that the recommendation, you've got a couple of people just devoted to that process. So I think that's a really good idea. So thank you.
Thanks. I will, this podium's at the right height, so I will not need my glasses to look at my notes. I am the Director of Planning and Economic Development for Manchester, Connecticut. I've been there for about 24 years, and before that I was a public sector planner in Western Pennsylvania, county government level as well. So Lyle asked me to, and invited me, I should say, to be here, and I'm pleased to be here. Lyle gave me a little bit of background and left the country, so I checked with a few folks. But I'd like to take on the role perhaps of commentator today about the work of the committee, which I think was an excellent analysis of state planning capacity or lack thereof and the need for it. And I'm going to comment a little bit about some of the things that, as Carol was speaking, which I think are very important points. Again, I think Carol explained through her model why this is important. Why is it important to have a comprehensive plan, which means you look at a lot of different components. You don't look at only transportation or only housing or only the environment or only healthcare or only education. You have to look at all of those areas of responsibility, look for relationships, look for connections, but the objective should be to decide where we want to go as a state and how the different municipalities fit into that and how the people of the state will benefit from that. All the people who work here, who have businesses here, who visit here, how is that all going to work together? And that does not often happen. It doesn't even happen very often at a local level. Looking at something comprehensively in all the parts can get to be very complicated and sometimes frustrating. And sometimes people just don't care to do that. But the ideal state is to do that. The other important point is to have a long-range view. And I would suggest that the report recommends that at least a 5-year horizon. The 5 years is not very long. It's 1 year over a governor's term. It's where I live, that's 2 council elections. So you've got, and it takes a long time to develop plans. There's a budget once a year. Once that money's locked in, you've got so much time to spend it. Major projects take a lot of time to design and build and monitor evaluate. Changes to educational and healthcare systems take years to realize themselves. So I would suggest that if we can get started, even in a 5-year term, the real goal should be to get at least to the horizon view, if not over the horizon. What about 15 or 20 or 25 years? A lot of the implications or things that are going to influence our future are here today. It's just that we look at what's here today and we don't kind of project that out. The 25 to 35-year-old age group is only going to be that age group for 10 years. Then they're going to be the 45 to 55-year-old age group. So we just always have to keep in mind things are always changing, and we have to take as long a view as possible. That comprehensive plan should ideally inform strategic plans, and again, the report recognizes this, that individual agencies or departments need to develop plans not for their department per se, but they need to develop plans that help achieve this larger objective and achieve this larger vision. And the silo planning problem and administration problem has been identified, and there are two really big silos. One is the legislature and one is the executive branch at the state government. And those silos need to be connected somehow, and this council may be, in fact, a way to do that if it can be formed and it can be sustained. And then you have all the individual agencies and individual commissioners. And there's a natural tendency, and you're public administrators, so I know you know this, there's a tendency to deal with immediate crises, short-term problems. We get more into problem-oriented policy or problem-oriented planning to deal with something that seems more immediate, that can be done in a short time. You can cut a ribbon, you can stand in front of a new school, you can open a service center, and there's just a natural tendency for us to do that. So the ability to look long-term is a luxury. It's got to be believed in, it's got to be invested in, and I hope that there's some traction for that as a result of this work. The silo problem also has other obvious implications, and that is that if you are not looking at the right goal, you're likely not to achieve what you would like to achieve. It's the difference between measuring outputs and outcomes. And this also can happen in the crush of doing business in a complex public sector environment. And I'll use as an example brownfields. Brownfields are contaminated, generally abandoned, old, obsolete sites, and most of them are going to be found in cities or first-tier suburbs, or even out in some outlying areas, old silk mills or paper mills or brass mills or whatever. They're obsolete for what they were originally intended for. Things that used to be perfectly acceptable, like dumping your oil and solvents on the ground, are not acceptable anymore. So there are programs developed to deal with brownfields, but the programs developed to deal with brownfields are looking at removing contaminants, and those programs may be limited to a certain kind of development. So instead of saying we want to develop brownfield sites so that they are a benefit to the communities where they are, and there's a use there that's active and fits the needs of that community, the needs of the market, we can sometimes cut things out. So if you have a brownfields program that will only clean up the site for economic development activities and not for housing or not for services, then you may be missing an opportunity to achieve something positive because we've limited ourselves because of our narrow silo focus. And that's on a very small project level, but that idea can be expanded to the statewide level as well. That's the challenge that we face. So the big question, I guess, is what are the keys to success? And the report, again, identifies a number of them. And I'd like to just emphasize, again, from my experience and my training, a few that I think are particularly important. One is that the vision that comes out of any kind of comprehensive planning process must be compelling, must be exciting, it must really capture the imagination, not only of the decision makers who are working on that or the people on the council, it must capture the imagination of a good part of the population. It's the strength of a story, it's the strength of a kind of dream, if you will, that people get, that people understand. And they understand the implications of not achieving that vision. They understand the risk. And to get to that kind of a vision, you really need, I believe, the right kind people. You need people in these analyst positions or on the council who are visionary, who are expert in looking at information, not only data sets, but also looking forward through that scenario analysis at what are the implications of the different choices that we make. What kind of things can we achieve if we look at things a little bit differently, if we invest in transportation differently, or healthcare differently, or education differently? How could this place look different in 15 to 20 years? And you've got to describe that in state in a way that people really, I think, get excited about it. So it's the quality of the plans. You know, a lot of the work, a lot of legislation in particular, I think can skip over the really hard part of what this is about. It kind of reminds me of the Steve Martin comedy routine where he said, "I'm going to tell you how to live like a millionaire. First, get $1 million." Now, that's the hard part. Getting that first $1 million is the hard part. Getting that vision or getting a good quality plan that agencies and people buy into is really hard. It's difficult. And it's something that requires a lot of energy, a lot of thought, the right mix of talent and leadership and commitment. But that's not, you just can't skip over that part of it. So you really need to have that for success. I think you also need to have this idea of breaking down the silos and giving people some common and agreed upon, goals that's got to benefit them, as we said. And we've got to break through a lot of barriers there. We've got to break through the motivations of the people who run for office, the people that are commissioners, the people that are going every day to work at some agency. How do you get them to buy into this so that they feel they're part of a team that's working towards some greater objective? And again, I use the analogy of a cathedral. You go to Europe. I was in Italy, and I went to the Santa Maria de Fiore in Florence, and it's a magnificent cathedral. It's 1,500 years old or whatever it is, but it took 150 years to build it. So there were generations of people that worked on that cathedral that never saw that cathedral. But the people in Florence believed in that vision, and they made a long-term commitment to build that cathedral. And what we're talking about, I think, is the equivalent of that, a long-term commitment to a very big vision that many of us may not see. I'll speak for myself. Many of us may not be around to see the culmination of that. So the idea of working towards something that's bigger than us is another, I think, kind of mindset that is important to these things. Now, I don't mean to get too philosophic, but we're going to talk about some of the challenges to achieving these plans. And the third thing is to have leadership. So it kind of begs the question: what happened to all the other efforts that went before in this arena? And there was, I think, the big thing is you need to have someone at the top. When we're talking about the government, I guess, and not the people generally, that says this plan and this vision is important. And I expect everybody who works for me, I'm the governor now, I expect everybody who works for me to make this happen. And so that executive branch level, you need strong commitment, you need good commissioners who also get that idea, you need them to convey that down through their organizations. The Connecticut Progress Council under Lowell Weicker was very successful at that. Good commissioners, they developed a lot of great policies, a lot of programs. They're all going all over the state telling the story of what they wanted to achieve. The legislature supported many of those initiatives. It's interesting that, as we all know, Governor Weicker was elected as an independent. He had no natural allies in the legislature, so what was the dynamic there that made that work? But he was not elected for that term. The Connecticut Progress Council kind of slipped away. It's still, on the paper, I guess, unless this legislation is passed, and we do a little housekeeping, but that's the kind of thing. It's the will and the leadership that makes it happen. It's not necessarily a structure or a law or hiring people. It's got to be something more than that, or else it doesn't happen. Which brings me to the kind of, so why might we be skeptical about the ability to pull this off? In spite of the excellent work that the committee did in analyzing this, in spite of I think when you read the report, you'll say, oh, well, sure, this is obviously important. So why does that not happen? Again, I think it's partly because as Carol alluded to, maybe we don't have enough of a crisis situation here. We don't have any dramatic cutoff of funding or disaster type scenario, which most communities actually do not have. Mostly, as again we all know, change is a gradual process for the most part. There might be a hurricane or some disaster, everybody rallies around it. But things like losing the population, failing to invest in infrastructure, not beginning to invest in mass transit now, although it's going to take 20 years to build a lot like rail or busways or change gravity airport, these kind of things do not have an immediate effect. And so people go about their lives, they're working, their kids are growing up, and they're driving, and they can still pay, $3, $3.50, they're still paying for gasoline. So there's no kind of crisis that is galvanizing everybody to one point. It's one of the challenges that we have. There are some organizations out there that have done very excellent work in this area of long-range planning. The Connecticut Institute for the 21st Century, I think, has done some work. There are other organizations around the state, the Economic Resource Center, Municipal Institute. There are other nonprofit organizations. And the point I make here is there are a lot of, again, there are the silos in the state government, and then there are the silos in the larger state population. There are interest groups and advocacy groups that are pushing for their own particular area of interest. And that kind of reinforces, through the legislative process and budget cycles, that reinforces the silo mentality. So that can also be a little bit of a challenge. But that is not to say that we should not certainly support the recommendations in this report. We should have a realistic view of it, though, and we should constantly, I think, be supporting the idea that we need to keep this long-term commitment, to keep this organization in place, the council, whatever it is, and hopefully that council will use places like the data center and analysts and planners to get that longer view and far-reaching vision and communicate it out to a lot of other people so that eventually this does become the way things work. There's a line in the report that I think struck me. I want to try to find it here. Because I wanted to quote it directly. But it's something like this. You can correct me here. But there's a line in the report that says that the council that is being recommended should not really concern itself with producing a plan or a document per se. But what it should produce is a process that changes the culture and accountability of government. And that is the kind of how do you make $1 million part of the question. And that's really, I think they've identified the challenges exactly, the recommendations. I think are a solid start. And that's speak for the Banking Association, I guess, but that's our perspective on why this is important and what some of the challenges may be. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mark. All right, questions for our very interesting and engaging panel? Questions from the audience?
I'm just kind of thinking maybe speaking a little bit more towards Kathy. What kind of feedback have you received when you were going through the process of getting this report together? Are you getting folks that say, "Oh, this is great, I really love to do it, but I've got too much work to do"? I was just kind of curious.
I think it runs the gamut. I think largely in some of the agencies, I think they believe that they're already doing it because I think that they're doing, what we said in the report is this very silo kind of aspect planning, where they're planning for their programs in their own agency and or responding to a legislative mandate that they produce a certain plan, or they're doing, the planning that brings in federal dollars. But it's not the type of planning that, feeds into what we see as a future that we want for the state of Connecticut. And there's nowhere in the state that's bringing all of those plans together and culling out even what might be in those plans that would meet an overarching goal. And secondly, and it came as somewhat of a surprise, I think, when we held a public hearing on the legislation last month, I think that one of the commissioners, the commissioner of the Department of Economic and Community Development, and we believe it's probably council is, has a lot of legislative representation on it, that maybe it's a usurping of the executive branch's initiative in terms of setting goals and planning, which it has traditionally been an administration function. I mean, the Progress Council had legislative members on it as well, and that's sort of what we argued. But so I think that while there are people that are supportive of it, I think that there are, in the agencies themselves, I think they may believe that they're already doing it, and there may be a reluctance in terms of the overall view of the administration that planning is being done, or that it's an executive branch function that should be shared. Yeah.
Other questions?
Given that, Mark, on your last point there, changing the culture in the absence of crisis, how do you do that? Given the fact that a number of these, obviously, state commissioners and departments feel that they're already planning adequately. Yeah, well, I actually had one of the other models is the model, I guess, of a university-based or some kind of independent, I hate to use the word think tank, but that's all I could come up with. But in some other discussions that I've been involved in around this issue, the idea that, again, is getting good information, getting the kind of analysis and perspective that Carol was doing with her, this kind of information does not get down to legislators and certainly not to the local level. And so in the absence of a council that is formed through the state government, as part of the state government, would another model, here's more of a question I guess, but would another model be for the state and other organizations to fund some sort of an institute that would develop some credibility as a neutral arbiter who could get information, do that long-range visioning, and convey that message out to the state, so that people would get these other perspectives. But I think it's just really, really important. I can't emphasize this enough. But I believe that it's important to have some, grander vision and longer view than we have. We've got to have that out to people so we can understand it. I'm sure we've all been to, you go to a conference somewhere, you're sitting in the audience, and some demographer gets up or some economist, and you say, man, I didn't think of that. And, because we're all, we're working. So I think that's one way to do it. We've got to get some way to get that plan out there. The state won't do it because of government term problems or some other law.
Could I just ask something? I did notice that the university model was mentioned, and it's something that's been adopted quite well in Arizona. There are sort of 4 or 5 different initiatives within the university, and the mandate of the president of the university is to engage in something called boundary research, which is beyond the sort of walls of academia into policymaking to conduct socially relevant research. And so that's sort of a lot of the initiative has come from the president of the university. And my PhD advisor is a really good model for this. She's always done policy work, but she's now running something called DCDC, which is the Decision Center for a Desert City. And she's funded by the National Science Foundation. And her mandate through, she's funded at the federal level, is to engage in work to understand how policymakers react to water, decisions about water in the face of climate uncertainty and growth. Water, it's the same fact as sort of a desert, in a desert environment. You absolutely can't function without it. So there is a really strong motivation for everyone to become involved in it. But one thing that has been very, very effective in this initiative has been the setting up of a decision theatre. And Actually, I should send the link out. It's there were wrapped around screens. It's like a movie theater, and I think they're seating for about 26 people. And the idea is that the scientists make the models, and then policymakers are invited to come into the theatre, and they have levers where they can say, okay, well, if we don't do anything, what's going to happen? And you can visually see things like the water table shrinking. And there's all sorts of different adaptations that can be put on, but it's the visualization of decision-making possibilities has been very, very effective, I think, in communicating. And then policymakers can see something tangible, and they can start thinking about that, and it's something that can be communicated quite well to the general public. So there are different ways to do things, but I agree it needs a lot of vision from a lot of different people.
To what extent is the solution wholly dependent on the individual in the governor's office? Not even party, but the individual, just this governor, but any governor. Is that where the solution lies in all of this?
I certainly think
I'm just saying
it's a
we're
crucial
legislature.
aspect, right? I work for the legislature, but I think it is a crucial aspect. I mean, I think in terms of just inspiration alone, if you don't, have someone at the top that believes that this is a priority and can share that or even require that of their commissioners, then it's not going to be a priority with them either. So I think it is crucial. I think you can. I think it's not something that you have to maybe come into office with. I'm still hoping that it's something that you can convince a governor that needs to be done. And in some respects, maybe she is getting there because she has been involved with the new responsible growth. And it started with her in an executive order, and last year was codified into statute. And so I think that's a start. Certainly, in terms of physical planning, I think an approach that can be expanded to what we're talking about in the report. But I don't think we're there yet.
I think if you look at the states that have been successful in doing this kind of thing, Maryland, Oregon, Washington, Virginia, New Jersey, it has been from the executive branch because they, when the governor ties into it and they control the commissioners, they control the administrative part of the government, you can pretty much be sure that things will happen. You need the money to do that, so you need legislative support as well, but it really is the CEOs doing it like any other basically business. So that's
Can you say those states again?
New Jersey, Maryland, Oregon, Washington, Virginia. I'm sure there are a few others that have, in respect to state planning functions. But again, a lot of them, Florida had a very progressive statewide planning and coordinated land use council until that governor was unelected, and then that stopped. Massachusetts had a very strong smart growth, consolidated orientation where the governor, I think it was before Romney, put together a cabinet. Doug Floyd was in charge of really 3 separate commissions. It was very successful, and they were making a lot of headway, and then the governor's office changed, and everybody went about new jobs. Jean McCarthy was very active up there. She's not a commissioner here, so you get that. The great thing when you have a governor, if they're around long enough, you can maybe make some headway. But when they're gone and the other governor doesn't believe it, you start to see that sort of way.
So have there been any, can you provide any examples of situations where the groundswell comes from someplace else? It starts, let's say, the business community saying, all right, we'd really love to stay here, but it's not going to happen. The future for us is not going to be in this state because, and that becomes a
especially from the citizenry. When you talk about Washington, Oregon, etc., you're talking about at least the perception of folks who are concerned about, let's say, the environment, etc. Could that possibly, or has that in the past, any place here or in other countries, been the impetus to start this process and keep it going long enough to institutionalize it? And that's what I'm hearing. This has to be this has to be insulated. This process has to continue and it has to be insulated from the natural turnover of the legislature and the governor.
One that I think it was Oregon, I think it was Northwestern, they're all the same. I think the original 1,000 Friends organization was 1,000 Friends of Oregon, and that group, in the 70s and into the 80s, focused on land use and development patterns in the state, and that led to some legislation and growth boundaries and other things. So that group was more of a grassroots organization that advanced that issue, and then that translated into legislation, and that was supported by a governor, and that's become, in a lot of ways, institutionalized in Washington. And then, of course, after that, a lot of 1,000 Friends groups sprung up around the country. There's one in Connecticut. Connecticut Partnership for Strong Communities, and the Home Connecticut group has been working on housing legislation. The Face of Connecticut. There are a lot of groups now that are, again, these advocacy organizations around a particular issue. CBIA is always in the legislature. So, yeah, I think it's there, but what is not there yet is this convergence where a lot of people agree on a few things, and that we don't have that kind of popular sentiment in Connecticut, I don't think, yet, that we probably have in other states where these kind of initiatives are really taken on.
And I will just make a comment. I think because you do have these individual groups who tend to be sort of clustered around a particular issue, and it might be sort of anti-sprawl or sort of pro-business or different things. They, depending on how active they are in different places and what the balance of power is, they might be able to sort of further silo initiatives. And what my sort of overarching impression is that what needs to happen is to get everyone together. It's a question of getting all the stakeholders to understand what these trade-offs are and to think in bigger terms about sustainability, because you can promote the environment to a certain extent, and then once sort of you reach some tipping point where there isn't the financial resources to sustain the plan, you might have to abandon all of the different initiatives. So it's not. I don't think it's a process of bringing all of the stakeholders together and getting them to communicate with each other about what's best in the bigger picture. I think that's really important.
I agree. It's very well said. I think in Washington State, the thing that brought the government management, accountability, and performance, that GMAP initiative about, and I think actually a book was written about it, is The Price of Government. And in Washington State, they were facing a severe budget crisis, and they recognized in the executive branch, business could not continue as usual. There needed to be a fundamental wholesale change, and that brought about this new way of looking at government, setting priorities, establishing overarching goals, and making sure that agencies and the commissioners were working up, to the same ends. So it can come out of a crisis mode, I guess.
Just to give you sort of a scenario, and then try to get some feedback on it. But we work with 9 different. I'm giving you a sort of a little crisis scenario here for you. We work with 9 different selectmen as a regional planning agency, and so there's kind of a question tied into this, which is, we have the larger silos at the state level and the investment, and then we also also have 169 silos and get investment from them. And from a crisis management standpoint, we at the regional level deal a lot with crisis because it's sort of a funnel. We get a lot of information from the state level of all the different agencies, and we see a lot of redundancy on the part of all the different agencies. And it's funneled down through us, and then we have to assimilate it and then try to redigest it and then feed it to the towns and say, okay, this is how you can respond in a cohesive fashion. And as we try to do that at a regional level, sometimes we get a kind of a backlash from the towns of, we have no confidence in state government. You know, I'm just wondering, Kathy, if you found that during your interviews, sort of that, we're going to do it on our own, and that sort of becomes that colloquial kind of mentality of, we're not going to invest, and I'm wondering what kind of implications does that have toward investing in long-term planning for the state, which would be beneficial, and would develop greater efficiencies and build. But right now, we're at sort of a stalemate, and how do you break that cycle? And I kind of see that data collection is an apolitical kind of way of breaking through that cycle. But I was wondering about your thoughts.
Well, certainly, as I pointed out, we did do a survey, and I know that state planning isn't, the state doesn't get high marks from the towns in terms of, vision or goal setting, and even, like you said, that they don't believe that, even state agencies agree with each other in terms of, whether it's a policy or an objective or whatever. So, yeah, that is a concern. I guess I see it also, though, that the towns, are not always part of the solution either. I mean, they seem to, want to make decisions regardless of what the data might show, and that, they too can, be very turf-oriented. So,
No, I agree. I said it, and while I hope I didn't paint this picture of everything in Arizona, for example, being harmonious. The individual players know quite well when to cooperate, and they can walk out the door, and if it's a different issue, all bets are off. So it's a very dynamic sort of game playing or sort of game theory process. So there's this definite understanding, but one thing that links back to this whole concept of having buy-in from all of the stakeholders is to maybe go out and ask all of the individual stakeholders what structure they would feel most comfortable with. Sort of instead of not to sort of diminish the model, but it is the committee have come and done a sort of a report saying, okay, we think this is the best model. One thing that just reminded me, because I was part of a survey group called it was the Phoenix Area Social Survey, and it's a long-term survey about things. It covers all sorts of things like quality of life and all sorts of different things. But one set of questions that we did ask was, who do you trust for your information? And it was the federal government, the local government, and then we did put university scientists in there. And they scored the highest in terms of impartiality. I don't think any of us scored very high. And there are ethical issues, and I think this was mentioned in the report as well. The idea of can a university body ever be impartial if we're all state employees? And there are ethical issues that need to be really closely considered in things like that. But just even asking people and asking the individual towns, given a choice, even if you wanted to do long-term planning, what would you see as the best way to do it? Would you trust more the information if it was held in a central sort of repository? Do you believe the sort of how objective do you think a commission might be versus a sort of a university group? So it might be just part of the process of buy-in, and I don't know how it would come out here. The individual towns or the general public may or may not trust scientists, but I think it's a process that's worth going through just for that whole buy-in and to understand what some of these challenges are sort of in a really sort of structured way.
managers or some group would need to push it to have it move over to the future.
Well, I'm not quite as pessimistic as you are.
All right.
Pollyanna perennial, I guess, I don't know. I think something of it may pass, I think the issue, I guess it is where the rubber meets the road, there isn't the money and the staffing attached to the bill, which is what the Office of Policy and Management, where this would be housed, has concerns about, and rightfully so. So I don't know if there's some way of dealing with that, maybe in the budget process and putting that in, while it's not part of the bill, making sure that, there are some recognition of what the resources would be to ensure that this happens. If that doesn't happen, then I guess, the concept of an oversight council and setting goals might happen, but I don't know that that's sustainable without, the core staff. In terms of what might happen, I just sort of see more of the same, I think, of the sort of silo planning, and people just doing what they've done before.
So it would take a group like CDIA or some group to move forward and begin the process.
Well, there's always next year, I guess, Yeah. And maybe if that is the only piece that, holds it back, then maybe next year there's, in a longer session, there's, more potential for getting assurances that the staffing and resources would be attached.
Any final, we're just about out of time, so any final thoughts from the panelists? Or one last question,
When you talk about the data that this is based on, the model and so forth, that policymakers have to make decisions and let the implications of those decisions. Is this council, is this group sort of putting together a giant sim city that the policymaker can play and see, there my community is affected in certain ways by these kind of decisions?
Well, I agree with Carol that, in our analysis, I think the state seems kind of data deprived. We have, a Department of Information Technology, but again, it's very silo-oriented there as well. So I don't think that, I think we're years away from being Sim City, but I don't see that as being sort of a major concern. I mean, I think that, in fact, it would be the other way, that when the council does get up and running, I think that they, maybe kind of years away from being able to have the data that we're talking about. But
there's actually a really well-developed urban simulation model called, it's Urban Sim, and it was developed out of the University of Washington. And I think that's been a large part of the success of places to do all of these sort of alternative futures. Seattle have got all sorts of different plans and land use and things like that. And I think it is part of the conversation with people here, with people in Connecticut, to say, do you want it? And it's hard. I can see the benefit. I can see what other places do with it, but it is part of the conversation. I think it's really important that the conversation has at least been started to say these gaps have been identified. Now, what do you want to do? What do we as a state want to do about them? And if the impetus if people say they would like to have tools like a simulation model, and that there are things that are very well developed, but we need data to populate them. It's not beyond comprehension that we could have things like that. it's fairly straightforward. It already exists for a lot of places. So I think it's just time for people to start making some decisions about what type of tools are deemed necessary to make the right to make informed policy decisions. I think that's what it is.
I'd just like to chime in on the data collection, and I think that we're closer to achieving what we need than most people think. We have our tax assessor databases, which are kept in every municipalities, which is full of data that can very easily be attached to a cadastral database, a parcel database that almost a good majority of the Connecticut towns already have. So I think it really, bears looking at how close we really are. I use it every day in my work, and I think we're really closer than most people think. So.
Well, that's encouraging, but I haven't been able to uncover that, the detail of it anyway.
Well,
That's wonderful.
I'd like to have, coffee.